Hi, my name is Matt Buffington. I'm a research entomologist with U.S. Department of Agriculture Systematic Entomology Lab. My specialty is on parasitoid Hymenoptera, their biology, their behavior, their taxonomy. And a big part of the work I do is collecting new specimens for either describing new species or supplementing the collection we already have in the National Museum. The primary tool I use for collecting is the sweep net. It's seen here. It's got a triangular head on it, which I'll explain its significance later. It's rather heavy. It's not the kind of net you chase down flying insects with. That's an aerial net. This one spends most of its time towards the ground, and the bag is made out of a mesh. It's very fine. It's silkscreen material. A lot of the insects we're after are extremely minute, 1 millimeter, right around there. So we need a very fine fabric to catch them. That's also fairly durable, because you don't want your bag to tear when you're in the field. Repairing something like this in the field is often very difficult. The other tool in my toolbox is a simple aspirator. This particular model is very efficient and very cost effective, and you can change out the containers as you fill it full of your target taxa. So these are the two items I use the most, and I'll show you in a minute how best to use them. So the technique that I employ the most was taught to me by John Noyes at the Natural History Museum, who incidentally invented this design, and we call it the Noyes net. He works on inserted wasps, and they spend most of their time on the ground or very near the ground. They're jumpers. They're not really flying around too much. So the net's really engineered for those kinds of insects. A lot of parasitoid Hymenoptera follow that same biology and that same behavioral pattern. So it works for just about everything, including flies and including a lot of beetles that live near the ground. This particular habitat is kind of a choice one for the groups that I work on, where you see lots of little flowers. The vegetation is not super thick. It's nice and green. There's lots of insects nectaring on these flowers, and there's lots of Hymenoptera that are parasitizing things that are living as immature stages right now down in the vegetation. I typically use a two-handed approach. Some people like a one hand. It's really up to you. It does get tiring after a while though, so two hands kind of helps alleviate that. And what I'm going to do is more or less drag this net along the ground in a long arc, sweeping about 170 degrees each arc. And I'm going to tilt the head as I sweep slightly forward about 5 to 6 degrees. And the reason we do this is as we hit the vegetation, insects are startled, and one of their responses often is to jump straight up. If this is angled a little bit, the insects, as we move the net, jump actually into the net bag, making our job a lot easier. Okay, so this is more or less how I do it. Very gentle. You typically don't damage the vegetation when you're doing this. In fact, if you are damaging the vegetation, you might be sweeping too hard. You can see the net's kind of bouncing along the ground. That's exactly where I want it to be. Sometimes it gets hung up like that. You just kind of have to power through it. And then when you're done with your run, I just hold it like this. That keeps things from escaping, and I can immediately see I've got an enormous amount of insect activity in here. If I look with my naked eye, I don't see anything. But the net reveals everything that's flying around here, and now it's all trapped, ready for me to aspirate out into my aspirator. This is the quarry from that recent sweeping of maybe 20 or 30 sweeps. I see a number of things in here right off the bat. There's spiders, of course. There are lots of typulids. There are impid flies. I see lots of little wasps. In addition to the little wasps that I have in here, which are obviously the target of my collecting, I see a few things that alarm me a little bit. Most notably, there's a hornet in here. I'm not after hornets, and on top of that, I'm mildly allergic to them. So getting these types of insects out, if you're not trying to collect them, is rather important, especially if you're allergic and you're far afield and you don't want to be rushed to the hospital. Letting these out is really important. These types of insects are very active flyers, and they're very good at navigating. Whereas the little wasps that I'm after aren't. They get confused and they won't leave the net readily. Even if I don't cinch this, a lot of them will still be in the bottom. So what I typically do first is scan the net bag, see if there's anything like a hornet in there, and then I'll open the net bag up and let it fly out. And with any luck, there she goes. And now quickly cinch it back up. And now this is what I'm actually going to aspirate. I'm actually going to use my aspirator, this system here, container that actually holds what I collect. This is powered by my mouth. I suck and insects go in the brass nozzle there. Now there's a couple important techniques to consider for really effective aspirating out of a net bag. First, you want to find a comfortable spot because you might be there a little while. Second, you want to see where the sun is. Because what I typically do to really increase the efficiency is I hold the net bag straight out like this. Eventually I'm going to put my hand at the end. I just don't want the insects to get out right now. So now I'm going to actually enter the net bag with my head and aspirator. One really important thing to consider, however, is you might be aspirating a while. If you've swept a long time, then you're going to have a lot of insects in here and you're going to be chasing them down. Things are going to emerge. Sometimes you get plant material with the sweep and their insects are tangled in the plant material. You have to let things kind of come out. So I like to find a comfortable spot, typically in the shade, with the end of the net bag in the sun. Now we do this because insects are typically phototropic. And if you hold the end of the net bag in the sun while you're in the shade, one, you stay cool. Second, the insects are attracted to the sun, which is the opposite end of the open part of the net bag. And that gives you a point of focus of the insects, so it's easier to target them. I prefer a crouching position unless I can find a stump that isn't covered in fire ants. I've done that. It's not a good idea. So the crouching position I assume is a traditional rifleman's position for hunting. I angle the handle out like this, shoulder the frame of the net bag on my left shoulder. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to go in with my right hand. And then open up, hold the net bag taut like this, and then start aspirating. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about sweep netting in general. It's about the oldest way in which we collect insects, and a lot of people use it for building general collections, etc. I would like to argue for a case of using the sweep net for actually very important scientific purposes. What you often don't get with a sweep netting sample is anything about the biology of the insects you're collecting. And some people don't like using a sweep net for that very purpose. I would like to convince you, though, that sweep netting tells you a few things right off the bat that are extremely important, that I don't know another more cost-efficient way of determining this information. One, it tells you immediately what habitats are really active right now. If you see a habitat that looks awesome, and it looks like something that might produce the insect you're after, if you sweep it and sweep it correctly, and you don't find it, it's very likely that insect's not there, or in such low numbers that it's not going to be collected readily. If it is there, however, it can help focus your attention. Maybe you swept an entire flowery little field, but the insect you're after is on one species. If you're good at netting and you're good at picking out plants to sweep, you can actually focus your sweep netting and find what patch is actually producing the insects that you're after. Some of the wasps I'm after attack flies in cowpats and carrion, and often those host substrates are long gone by the time the parasitoids emerge from the soil where the flies that they were attacking pupated. But with a sweep net, I can triangulate where that carcass or where that cowpat used to be and actually get right on the ground and see things coming out of the soil. If I had a trap running nearby or pan traps maybe. I could also kind of do that, but the net gives you immediate access to that ecological data right off the bat. And I just mentioned the term ecological data. One of the other reasons why some people don't like the sweep net is it's not a replicatable type of collecting method. And I would argue it actually is, and I've seen people do this in practice. You can run a transect on a tape and walk that transect with a sweep net at a very regular pace, maybe even count your sweeps, and that can actually be a replicatable sampling regime. My colleague Simon Van Noort in Cape Town has done this. He literally has counted his sweep net samples, over the course of a field season, and actually use that to calculate species richness and abundance quite effectively, and it is replicatable. The other kind of hidden or bonus to using a sweep net as your sampling method is you actually get to see the insects alive right in front of you. The other type of collecting techniques that we often employ, including the yellow pan trap and the Malaise trap, you find the insects after they've already deceased. In the net, you can see what they do. You can see, are they jumpers? Are they flyers? How do they hold their antennae when they're alive? Do they raise their wings before they're about to fly, or do they jump and then raise their wings? There's different kinds of behavioral things, and when you begin to look at them very carefully and watch them very patiently, you can actually begin to pinpoint the species you're after, or maybe the family you're after, quite readily in the net. And then you can aspirate just them and leave everything else if you're after something very specific. In the case of this collecting I'm doing right now, I have never been to this site before. I don't know when I'm going to come back. Therefore, when I aspirate everything, because there are flies in here that colleagues of mine can use, there's beetles in here that colleagues of mine can use. I don't know if the wasp I'm after is in here or not, but I'm going to aspirate everything and then take it back to the lab, because entomology is a numbers game in terms of taxonomy. You never really know what you have, so if you take the maximum number of samples possible, it's going to increase your chances of success. And if you travel into a foreign country where maybe it's taken a year to negotiate a collecting permit, maybe even longer to secure funding, you don't want to, in my opinion, you don't want to hamstring yourself right off the bat by doing very selective things when you can collect everything. I mean, depending on your permit, of course. Because the specimens you're collecting, the sample you're collecting may not contain the species you're after, but it might contain something a friend of yours wants. And that's always a nice collaborative way to work. That's one of the things I love about entomology, is the network aspect of it. And that's how we sweep net with a noise net. Thank you.